Motorcycle manufacturers buried a dirty secret that cost riders millions in repairs. What if I told you that some of the most celebrated engines in history were ticking time bombs that destroyed themselves at highway speed? That's not an exaggeration. Thousands of engines literally tore themselves apart because engineers ignored basic physics. Imagine dropping 30 grand on an Italian exotic only to watch it seize up before you hit 500 miles. In this video, I'm counting down the worst motorcycle engines ever built. Catastrophic failures that bankrupted companies and left riders stranded. And number one might shock you because this engine stayed in production for nearly 50 years, despite being fundamentally broken. Stick around because these aren't just bad bikes. They're engineering disasters that should never have left the factory floor. Number 4, the Ural Boxer Twin. Let's start with an engine that represents failure through pure stubbornness. The Ural Boxer Twin isn't just outdated. It's a World War II design that somehow survived into the 21st century without meaningful improvement. This power plant is a direct copy of the BMW R71 from 1941. Think about that for a second. We're riding motorcycles in 2025, powered by technology that predates transistors, fuel injection, and modern metallurgy. The Ural company essentially hit copy and paste on a German military design and called it good enough for 80 years. The problem isn't nostalgia, it's that this engine fails constantly and in every possible way. Owners don't report one specific weak point because there isn't one. The entire machine operates at a level of quality control that would embarrass a high school shop class. Brakes fail. The final drive grenades itself. Transmissions grind to dust. Pistons burn through. And the electrical system operates on what can only be described as wishful thinking. Here's where it gets interesting. The tolerances in Ural engines are so loose that performance varies wildly between individual bikes. You might get one that runs acceptably for a season, or you might get one that leaves you on the side of the road every 100 miles. It's a mechanical lottery where everyone loses eventually. The Boxer Twin configuration itself isn't the problem. BMW proved that design works when executed properly. The issue is that Ural uses manufacturing methods and materials that were outdated 50 years ago. The cylinder heads are inconsistently cast. The piston rings don't seal properly. The valve train components wear at accelerated rates because the metallurgy can't handle sustained operation at modern highway speeds. When you dig into owner forums, the pattern becomes crystal clear. Every Ural owner has stories. The bike that wouldn't start because corrosion destroyed the wiring harness. The transmission that jumped out of second gear on the highway. The final drive that scattered gears across the road. The clutch that disintegrated without warning. These aren't isolated incidents. They're the expected ownership experience. The archaic design means parts wear rapidly. The outdated metallurgy can't handle modern riding conditions. And the quality control during assembly ranges from questionable to completely absent. This isn't a bike that develops issues after years of hard use. These engines arrive from the factory already carrying the seeds of their own destruction. The carburation is primitive even by vintage standards. The ignition system fights against basic electrical theory. The cooling system barely manages heat under load. Every component operates at the absolute minimum acceptable threshold. And when you combine multiple minimum threshold systems, failure becomes inevitable. What makes the Ural truly remarkable is that its unreliability has become part of its identity. Enthusiasts actually embrace the constant repairs as character. They'll tell you it's charming to carry a full toolkit and spare parts on every ride. But strip away the romanticization, and you're left with an engine that fails every basic metric of modern reliability. The transmission regularly jams. The shaft drive system that should last hundreds of thousands of miles needs constant attention. The electrics are so unreliable that riders joke about which system will fail next, not if it will fail. This isn't vintage charm, it's systematic mechanical incompetence preserved in production. New owners quickly learn that the Ural doesn't compare to any other motorcycle. The vibration is excessive. The oil consumption is alarming. The tendency for components to simply stop working mid-ride is accepted as normal. When your baseline expectation is that something will break on every long ride, the bar for reliability has been set impossibly low. Number 3. The Norton Commando Combat. The Norton Commando engine should have been a triumph. British engineering, classic styling, and genuine performance potential. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about pushing components beyond their design limits without proper reinforcement. The standard Commando engine from 1968 onward had issues, but they were manageable. Then Norton created the Combat specification in 1972, and everything went catastrophically wrong. The Combat engine was tuned for more power through higher compression and aggressive cam profiles. On paper, it looked impressive. In practice, it destroyed itself with mechanical precision. The root cause was the main bearing design. The Commando engine used a single main bearing to support the entire crankshaft. This was adequate for the standard engine output, but barely. When Norton increased power for the Combat model, they fundamentally changed the stress loads without upgrading the supporting architecture. The result was predictable and devastating. The single main bearing faced forces it simply couldn't handle. Every power stroke created torsional loads that exceeded the bearing's capacity. The oil film would break down under the extreme pressure. Metal-to-metal contact would begin, generating heat and accelerating wear. And because this was the only bearing supporting the crank, there was no redundancy, no backup, no safety margin. The main bearing would fail, usually within the first few thousand miles. And when a main bearing fails in a motorcycle engine, it doesn't just wear out gracefully. The crankshaft begins to move in ways it was never designed to move. This creates secondary damage throughout the engine. Connecting rods fail, the crankcase cracks, internal components shatter. What starts as a bearing problem cascades into a total engine destruction. The failure progression followed a terrifying pattern. First, a slight knock would develop, often dismissed as normal engine noise. Then oil pressure would drop as the bearing clearances opened up. The knock would intensify as the crank wobbled in its mounting. And finally, catastrophic failure would occur, usually at the worst possible time, full throttle on a highway or climbing a steep grade under load. Owners reported the failure pattern with disturbing consistency. The engine would develop a knock. If caught immediately, a bearing replacement might save it. But most riders didn't recognize the warning signs in time. By the time the knock became obvious, the damage was already terminal. Complete engine rebuilds became mandatory for Combat owners, often at mileage that should represent the break-in period, not the end of life. The financial impact was brutal. A new Combat cost serious money. The promised performance never materialized because the engine couldn't survive long enough to be enjoyed, and the repair costs often exceeded the bike's value. Owners faced a choice between a complete teardown and bearing upgrade, or watching their investment become scrap metal. Norton knew about the problem almost immediately. The failure rate was impossible to ignore. Dealers reported warranty claims flooding in. Riders demanded answers. The company's reputation was disintegrating as fast as the Combat bearings. Their solution was to rush out the Super Blend bearing, an upgraded design that actually worked. But this fix came too late for the Combat's reputation and too late for the thousands of engines already suffering in the field. The Super Blend bearing used better materials and tighter tolerances. It could actually handle the power output Norton demanded. But its introduction was an admission of failure. Norton confirmed that the original bearing was inadequate, that they had released bikes with a known weakness, and that owners were left holding the bag. Here's what makes this failure so significant. This wasn't a manufacturing defect where a batch of bad parts slipped through. This was a fundamental miscalculation at the engineering level. Norton took an engine operating near its stress limits and added more power without addressing the weakest link. They prioritized marketing and performance figures over mechanical reality, and riders paid the price with destroyed engines. The bearing wasn't the only problem the increased power revealed. The crankcase itself was marginal for the new stress levels. The connecting rods were being pushed beyond their fatigue limits. The entire bottom end was overloaded. But the bearing failed first, and when it went, it took everything else with it. The Combat engine represents stress failure in its purest form. When you push a component past its design parameters without proper reinforcement, failure isn't a possibility, it's a guarantee. The bearing couldn't handle the loads, the crankshaft couldn't maintain alignment, and the entire lower end disintegrated under forces it was never built to withstand. Buying a Norton Commando today, especially a Combat model, means immediate bearing replacement isn't optional maintenance. It's mandatory survival. You're not preserving history by running original bearings. You're waiting for catastrophic failure that will cost 10 times more than preventative replacement. The bearing upgrade should happen before the first ride, not after the engine destroys itself. Number 2. The Bimota V-Due 500. Some engines fail because they're outdated. Some fail from poor quality control. The Bimota V-Due failed because it tried to accomplish the impossible and brought down an entire company in the process. The V-Due launched in 1997 with a $30,000 price tag and massive ambition. Bimota wanted to create a road-legal 500cc two-stroke that could pass 50 state emissions testing in the United States. This was genuinely innovative. Two-strokes are efficient and powerful, but they're also dirty. The solution was direct fuel injection, a proprietary system that Bimota developed specifically for this engine. The DFI system passed emissions testing. That's important to understand. On paper, in controlled conditions, the technology worked. But passing a test and functioning in real-world riding are completely different standards, and Bimota was about to learn that lesson at the cost of their entire company. The theoretical advantages of direct fuel injection in a two-stroke are significant. You can precisely control fuel delivery, reduce unburned hydrocarbons, and maintain the power-to-weight benefits that make two-strokes attractive. But the execution requires sophisticated electronics, precise sensors, and software calibration that can adapt to varying conditions. Bimota had the theory right, but the implementation catastrophically wrong. Owners reported that the bikes were almost completely unrideable straight from the dealership. The throttle response was atrocious. The engine would hunt and surge at steady speeds, making smooth riding impossible. Power delivery was violent and unpredictable, lurching between nothing and full power with no warning. And the spark plugs fouled constantly, requiring replacement after minimal riding. The hunting problem revealed the core software issue. The fuel injection system couldn't maintain stable fuel mapping. It would over-enrich, then over-lean, constantly searching for a balance it could never find. This created a riding experience where you couldn't maintain consistent speed without the engine bucking and surging beneath you. The power delivery issues were even more dangerous. Smooth throttle input would produce nothing. Then suddenly the engine would dump full power with no progression. This made low-speed maneuvering hazardous and highway riding terrifying. You couldn't predict how the bike would respond to your inputs, which is fundamentally incompatible with safe motorcycle operation. This wasn't a minor inconvenience. These bikes cost as much as a luxury car and perform worse than a 50-year-old carbureted machine. The DFI system that was supposed to be revolutionary turned out to be fundamentally broken. The electronics couldn't manage fuel delivery smoothly. The sensors couldn't compensate for varying conditions. The entire concept was half developed and pushed into production before it was ready. Bimota faced immediate backlash. Returns flooded in. Dealers refused to accept more inventory. The motorcycle press savaged the bike in reviews. The company attempted to fix the DFI system, but couldn't solve the fundamental problems. The software was inadequate. The hardware couldn't execute the required precision, and every attempted fix revealed new problems. So in 1998, they released the Evoluzione upgrade, which completely scrapped the direct fuel injection and replaced it with traditional Dell'Orto carburetors. Think about what that means. The entire selling point of the V-Due was advanced fuel injection technology that could make a two-stroke emissions compliant. When that failed, Bimota admitted defeat by reverting to carburetors, the very technology they were trying to replace. They destroyed their own innovation and still couldn't save the motorcycle. The carburetor conversion solved the rideability issues, but created new problems. The bike could no longer pass emissions testing in many markets. The unique selling proposition vanished, and owners who'd paid $30,000 for cutting-edge technology now owned carbureted two-strokes that performed like machines from decades earlier. But the failures went deeper than fuel delivery. The engines suffered severe crank seal problems. Two-stroke engines rely on crankcase pressure for proper operation. When crank seals leak, the pressure differential disappears, and the engine loses power, runs poorly, and consumes excessive oil. The V-Due seals failed regularly and rapidly. In desperation, Bimota attempted to machine the crankshaft to accept a larger, more robust seal. This modification was supposed to fix the leaking problem. Instead, it created a new catastrophe. The machining weakened the crankshaft itself, and these modified cranks began failing in spectacular fashion. Crankshaft failure in a two-stroke is terminal. The crank connects directly to the piston. When it fails, the piston can seize, the connecting rod can punch through the crankcase, or the entire assembly can lock up instantly. At speed, any of these failures can cause a crash. Bimota had turned a reliability problem into a safety crisis. Now riders faced multiple cascading failures. The fuel system didn't work, the crank seals leaked, and the crankshafts themselves were shattering. This wasn't a motorcycle with problems. It was a mechanical disaster on two wheels. Every attempted fix made things worse. Every solution introduced new failures. The engineering spiral was out of control. The warranty claims were unsustainable. Bimota was replacing entire engines under warranty. They were buying bikes back from owners. The cost of the recalls and repairs far exceeded the profit from sales. And sales had stopped completely because nobody would buy a motorcycle with this reputation. Bimota went bankrupt in 1999. The V-Due didn't just fail, it killed the company. The cost of recalls, returns, and warranty work was unsustainable. The reputational damage was irreparable. A motorcycle manufacturer with decades of history ceased to exist because they couldn't deliver on the promises of one ambitious engine. The V-Due represents technological overreach at its most destructive. Bimota tried to solve a complex emissions problem with immature technology. They rushed a half-developed system into production because they had already committed to the project financially and reputationally. When the technology failed, they couldn't pivot fast enough to save themselves. Before we get to the #1 worst engine, and trust me, this one stayed in production despite being fundamentally flawed for nearly half a century, make sure you're subscribed. The stories get worse from here, and you won't want to miss the engineering disasters we're covering in upcoming videos. Number 1. The Harley-Davidson Rigid. The worst motorcycle engine in history isn't the one that failed catastrophically. It isn't the one that bankrupted its manufacturer. The worst engine is the one that punished riders for nearly 50 years, while the company refused to fix a known, solvable problem because tradition mattered more than rider comfort. The Harley-Davidson Sportster rigid mount engine represents a failure so fundamental, so persistent, and so completely inexcusable that it stands alone in motorcycle history. From 1957 to 2003, Harley bolted the Sportster engine directly to the frame with no isolation, no dampening, and no consideration for what that would do to anyone actually riding the motorcycle. The problem stems from basic physics that Harley engineers absolutely understood. A 45-degree V-twin has inherent primary imbalance. The firing order creates vibration. When that engine is rubber-mounted or counterbalanced, the vibration can be managed. When it's bolted rigidly to the frame, every single vibration pulse transmits directly through the chassis, through the controls, through the seat, and into the rider's body. At low speeds, this is uncomfortable. At highway speeds, it becomes unbearable. Riders describe the rigid mount Sportster as shaking like a crack baby. That's not exaggeration. That's the actual experience of trying to cruise at 60 miles per hour on a bike that was designed without consideration for the speeds that American highways demand. The Ironhead era from 1957 to 1986 established the problem. These engines were rigid mounted from day one. When Harley introduced the Evolution engine in 1986, they updated the internals for better reliability and performance, but they kept the rigid mounting. For another 17 years, they sold motorcycles that they knew would shake riders apart at highway speeds because changing the design would mean admitting the original approach was wrong. This wasn't a minor comfort issue. Prolonged exposure to this level of vibration causes physical damage. Hands go numb, arms fatigue, lower back problems develop. The vibration doesn't just make the ride unpleasant, it actively harms the rider's body over time. And Harley sold this design for decades, while competitors offered smooth, comfortable bikes that could cruise all day without punishment. The failure becomes more obvious when you understand that the technology to fix this existed the entire time. Rubber engine mounts were not new technology. Other manufacturers used them successfully. The engineering solution was proven and available. Harley chose tradition over function, and riders suffered for it. In 2004, Harley finally admitted the problem by completely redesigning the Sportster frame to incorporate rubber engine mounts. The change was immediate and dramatic. The rubber mount Sportsters were actually comfortable. The vibration decreased to tolerable levels. Riders could finally cruise at highway speeds without their motorcycles trying to shake them off. But even this solution came with ongoing costs. Rubber mounts are consumables. They're estimated to last about 7 years before the rubber hardens and sags. When the mounts deteriorate, the vibration returns. So the fix for the rigid mount problem became a recurring maintenance expense, replacing motor mounts every 7 years to maintain the comfort that should have been designed in from the beginning. The rigid mount Sportster represents the failure of stagnation in its most damaging form. Harley prioritized brand identity and traditional design over rider experience in basic ergonomics. They knew the bikes were uncomfortable. They knew the vibration was excessive. They knew competitors offered better solutions. And they kept selling the same fundamentally flawed design for almost half a century. This engine tops the list because, unlike the Norton bearings or the Bimota fuel injection, the Sportster's problem was never a mystery. It wasn't a miscalculation or a technological reach too far. It was a conscious choice to prioritize marketing and tradition over the physical well-being of the people who bought their motorcycles. Harley could have fixed this in the 1960s. They chose not to. That makes it the worst engine failure in motorcycle history. These engines failed because they couldn't handle their own design flaws. But some engines failed for the opposite reason. They were simply too powerful for their era. Check out my video on 13 motorcycle engines that were too powerful for their time to see which power plants pushed beyond what technology could contain.